Hey. So today we're going to be walking through the Orchestra MCP server. We're going to be taking a little look at what it can do, how to set it up in a tool like Cursor. Then we're going to have a quick play around and see what kind of things we can ask it and the responses we get. And then I'm just going to leave you with a little bit on our documentation MCP that we also have and the differences. So what would we use the MCP server for anyway? Well, some of the features are listed here. You can see that we would use it for things like pipeline management, if we want to look at the status of our runs and just ask it questions in natural language to see what's happened today. Same with tasks and operations. We can go into the pipelines themselves and ask questions about how that task failed or why it failed or what else it's doing. We can look through the assets that are produced. So what's going on with our snowflake tables, or when were they last refreshed, and things like that. We can import pipelines. So rather than using the CLI, we can import them. We can sync them to our Git repositories and do other bits with them. And finally, we can do stuff with our logs and artifacts produced. So for those of you who are heavy DBT users, being able to just retrieve your latest manifest, pretty cool for just doing that on its own. And if you really want to get into it, you can come into this repository and start having a dig around in the code itself to find out kind of what else it does and how it works if you really want to, but that's up to you. So how do we get it set up and started? Well, you can just follow the installation guide on the README, and very quickly you'll be set up and kind of ready to go with this. So install UV if you haven't already got UV installed, depending on how much Python you do. Then you're going to want to export your Orchestra API key, which you can find in the workspace, which you can check the docs for. And then finally, once you've cloned this repository, you're just going to go in there and whichever command you like, run the MCP server. Easy. Now that my MCP server is running, the next obvious question is, how do I use it? So I'm going to show you how to configure it in Cursor, but you can configure these in whichever client you want using your kind of usual way of adding MCP servers to it. In this case, I'm actually just going to steal the fastmcp command and run fastmcp install into Cursor. And as you can see, it opens up Cursor for me with the MCP window. If I just check the details, you can see it's the Orchestra MCP server with these given arguments, which has the right location of where I just kicked the server off from. And if we come down here, we can actually see in Cursor the list of tools that it says are available. So you can see I have a bunch of operations I can do, like list pipelines, list task runs, I can get artifacts, all the kind of things we saw on the README earlier. Now, if you don't want to be putting your API key into your environment all the time, one thing you can do is come into here, click edit on the MCP, which will take you to mcp.json, I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with. And you can actually just set your Orchestra API key in the environment to always be picked up whenever you start running the server. Once you've done all that, just remember to restart Cursor for all these changes to take effect, and then you're good to go. Awesome. So now we've got that set up, you can start asking it some questions and see how it does. So first thing I'm going to ask it is which pipelines failed today, and I'm going to give it a date just to be sure. But hopefully it goes away and starts hitting the MCP server and bringing back lots of metadata about my pipelines and generally how they did. We can see already that it's found the Orchestra MCP and started listing pipeline runs for the day. And now it's going to go and dig around for the metadata and other interesting things about those. So let's see what it comes back with. There we go. So we have 4 pipelines that have failed today, which is not ideal. But we also have a little bit of data about them, so we know when they failed, we know their names, but that's not really enough to start debugging. So let's ask, why did the DLT/DBT pipeline fail? And this gives it a chance to go away, take the context of the pipeline it just found, and start digging through all the tasks and logs that were in that pipeline to try and give me some reasoning as to why that pipeline failed today, rather than just the fact it did. And after a little while, it's come back with a whole host of things that went wrong in that pipeline. So not ideal, but it's given us a nice little summary of, Fivetran failed, and then your Postgres tasks failed, and then my DBT tasks failed, so everything failed. But what if we want to do more than look at failures? So, for example, let's start looking at our DBT jobs, because pretty much everybody has those. So say I'm running a whole bunch of DBT pipelines in my account, I'm just going to ask it, what's the status of my DBT jobs? And as you can see, it's used the name to figure out which of my pipelines have DBT in them. But what if we want to do something more interesting than just look at the status of the pipelines? Well, let's take that Databricks DBT run, for example. Let's say, get me the manifest for the Databricks DBT latest run. And it's going to go away, look through the MCP, and start using different endpoints to find the right task, the latest task, and then download the DBT artifacts that were associated with the latest run. And there we go. As you can see, it's actually found the right pipeline run today, 3:30. It's found the task that runs DBT, and then it's downloaded the actual manifest for that run and saved it to my local directory, which is pretty sick. And finally, we're just going to run through a quick example of how you can search assets in Orchestra. So assets could be across pipelines, they could be across different accounts, could be across all sorts of things, and you can just start asking questions about them and finding out different bits of metadata. So I've asked it, when was the customer's clean asset last updated in Snowflake? And as you can see, it's once again gone to the Orchestra MCP, and it's actually found it in 2 different Snowflake accounts. So I wouldn't have been limited by looking in the UI because I've just gone through the MCP instead. And I can actually see when this table was last updated in 2 different Snowflake accounts, right in one place. So pretty cool. And that is pretty much it for the Orchestra MCP right now. You can find our docs page in our docs site, which has a link to the GitHub repo to get you started. And then you can just start hitting it with whatever queries and workflows are of interest to you, really. But when I started this, I did say we had one more thing, and that was the Orchestra Docs MCP. So if perhaps you don't want to have access to actually interacting with Orchestra directly in your MCP and you just want to use it for informational purposes, then you could alternatively connect just to the documentation MCP and use that for building things locally, like pipelines or any other kind of tasks or bits of Orchestra you're interested in. Of course, these are built into Orchestra, so you can use them in there too. But otherwise, have a crack. And yeah, thanks for listening.